Kind of like a squid, it's able to shoot ink out to create a shape, which is essentially kind of like a character, like in Japanese or Asian written languages. Each one is always circular in shape, but always follows a slightly different pattern and indentations, and that is always a fully formed sentence, thought, or idea in their language. We don't just talk in circles, we live it, because this week it's Arrival from 2016, directed by Denis Villeneuve.
When giant alien spaceships land on Earth, a language expert is recruited in an attempt to make communication.
We've reviewed Independence Day before, so don't get me wrong, it's a fucking brilliant film. One of the most fun films ever. Contender for best first half of a film ever. But it's a goof. At one point, Will Smith knocks out not just the alien, but the alien suit and says, "Welcome to Earth, bitch." And so you know the film you're getting. There's very few sci-fi films that, as Kubrick put it when he was making 2001: A Space Odyssey, are proverbially good and sound, make actual scientific sense, and really explore the potential realities of the crazy scenarios that science fiction can throw up. 2001: Space Odyssey is kind of like the perfect go-to example, and it's even harder because it's a film that deals with alien contact with Earth, or alien influence on man's evolution in the case of that film. It's such a hard thing to explore of what it really would be like. Firstly, because there's no precedent at all. There's nothing to look at unless you sort of go into the conspiracy stuff, which I'm always happy to do. Fucking love that shit. But there's no accepted, if you're making a film about a weird exotic animal that's not been discovered, that lives in the Congo and starts hunting these group of researchers that go down there, you have all of National Geographic and every time you visit the zoo to go by. But there's really nothing to go by for what it actually would be like to meet something alien. And our conception of aliens, especially in popular culture, is, the grey men, and they're very different and they fly spaceships, but they're basically just goofy looking humans. They're humanoid in shape. They probably have a language. Maybe they don't speak anymore, but they speak telepathically, but they basically live our existence. But the whole word alien means completely removed, completely different, so different we couldn't even understand it. And 2001 handles it by never showing the aliens at all, even though they're there and they're completely integral to the film. And this film handles it by exploring what it would be like for a alien species to meet us and not just have a different evolutionary trajectory, but have a completely different perception of how their brains interface with the quantum mechanic makeup of the universe, the ones and zeros underneath. Tapping this chair and it's solid, but supposedly according to science it's actually atoms that are separated, or not even atoms, it's waves, but my brain touches it and because of the array it becomes solid as opposed to a gas, as opposed to a liquid. And we take it for granted that another intelligent species out there in space that would come to visit the Earth, or that we would come across in one of Elon Musk's rockets one day maybe, would experience that the same way. We probably couldn't get past the idea of an alien species that was pretty similar to us, but instead of man and woman, there was 6 different things, and they all have to join up at one point in order to breed. Even something as simple as that would be just culturally and scientifically and just the way we perceive life and everything just be so difficult to grasp, let alone the entire perception of reality being different. So this film does a great job selling that concept to the audience, the idea that having any kind of understanding between two completely different intelligence, two completely different species might be so beyond our grasp. It might be just incomprehensibly complicated. It might even be completely impossible just by the nature of it, of how they exist, what sensory organs they use. We take it for granted that the world is something you can see, touch, feel, but maybe they can't see light, but they pick up radio waves, and bats see through sound, which is a weird thing that we don't really understand. We can do mock-up CGIs in animal documentaries, but we don't really understand it. And that's the beauty of this film, and at its heart is language, and that's why the main character, Louise Banks, is a language expert.
Unlike all written human languages, their writing is semisiographic. It conveys meaning. It doesn't represent sound.
Films about language are a hard one for me, getting my U in Spanish in school.
I actually didn't even turn up to my Spanish exam. I walked out the door and I thought it'd genuinely be a better use of time just to go get a haircut.
Well, you didn't turn up for it, but there's one part of the exam where you have to go into a room. They're like recording you speaking. Say, I want you to come over to my house. And all I knew was the words for swimming pools. I was like, mi piscina. It's funny because remember when we used to do Spanish as like kids or whatever, I used to think like, what's the point of this? We're never going to use Spanish. Like, this is just a waste of time. And that's childish behavior, because now I've got older, I realized how important communication and language is with a human being. And this film does a really great job of driving home that fact.
Firstly, I think in this country, English people are known around the world as being arrogant scumbags that don't learn other people's languages. Now, firstly, if everyone spoke Spanish in the world, everyone you meet, you wouldn't bother learning other languages. But secondly, they start teaching it too late. Like, why do they only start teaching it in secondary school? Especially with, modern translation devices and using ChatGPT and all these things. Translation is going to become so easy and so accessible where it will become less and less relevant. But it's an interesting thing where when you have thoughts, sometimes you have that internal monologue that might be like, hey, you're shitty, don't go to sleep now. Think of an argument you might have with someone. But you also have thoughts that kind of come in like a raw form. You have a thought and then you try and articulate it with these clumsy words that don't really work, and maybe you're not that articulate to begin with and it's difficult. Language is essentially an array of Lego blocks that you can use to assemble a meme version of what your actual idea is that will never do it justice, but it's the best you can get. There is that whole line of science that thinks the set of assembly Lego blocks you get in the form of like English or Spanish or Japanese or Chinese, and the way they're set up so differently, like with Spanish with the female and male versions, that can actually completely change or define to an extent the way your mind works and the way you think about things and the way you perceive things. And it's interesting where that again plays into this film, where the form of communication and the form of thinking and the language that you use to communicate with beings other than yourself completely can change your perception of reality in small ways, but also in giant incomprehensible ways like we see towards the end of this film.
What I liked about the lead up to that is when she knew that the aliens were landing, obviously because she can speak different languages, she was watching newscasts from all over the world. So it was like a Brazilian news channel speaking in Portuguese, and I was like, that's really clever.
It's weird because at the minute there's a lot of UFO stuff in the news, the drone stuff, the UFO congressional meetings. It's just in the news a lot, and it's interesting where you're watching the news coverage briefly in the opening scenes as Louise Banks is at university and she's teaching a class and there's hardly anyone in it, and one of them's like, oh, can you turn on the news? And we start hearing about first arrival of these giant crafts and we don't get to see it, so it does a good job of teasing it and building up the suspense of what these things are. One thing this director is amazing at, like you see it in Sicario as well, is building that sense of dread to the point where sometimes the script doesn't necessarily deliver. I think it does in this film thoroughly, but it doesn't always necessarily deliver, but it doesn't really matter. Like, he could show you walking to the bus stop because you're going to work. You're checking your watch because the bus hasn't shown up, but he would direct it in such a way where you would feel like, oh my God, this is life or death. Like, what's going to happen? And he does such a good job of that. But it's funny because I feel like when films try and show the news discussing an alien contact or invasion or whatever in films, they nearly show too much restraint. It would be goofier, it would be sillier, especially with like modern social media and stuff where everyone can be reporting themselves and the news uses the clips. It would be a bit wackier and crazier than how it's conveyed, but I feel like they're always quite restrained about it.
She gets all the way to her class and she doesn't know anything about it. What, this film released in 2016, yeah? I assume that she would look at her phone as soon as she wakes up in the morning, so like surely it'll be like bang, bang all over it. But it kind of makes it better in a way that she's unaware of it, and then we get her reaction as the viewer when she opens the big wall cabinet and the TV's there, and she's just looking at it, and what would you think? I'm a pessimist, as you know, Declan. I would just be like, we're fucked. And you do see that in the films because people are starting to loot and do shit like that. I mean, look at COVID in this country. We couldn't even even get fucking toilet paper. What's going to happen when a fucking alien craft lands?
I think it would depend on a bunch of things. If they turn up and they're not immediately wiping us out, I'd be like, sweet, we're good. If they're not immediately wiping us out, say like they're not even that much further advanced than us, but they're 100 years and they could arrive here in big ships, they could destroy us so easily. Yeah. But I always think, if they're actually that far advanced, why is it people only ever assume their weapons are super futuristic? Why is it not their energy sources? Why is there not, like in 1,000 years time, maybe a couple of 100 years time, we'll have figured out how to just suck energy right out of the fabric of the universe, 0 point energy where there's no loss, virtually no expenditure, but just boundless free energy. We'll probably be able to reshape matter into the array of atoms so that, just useless rock can become any material from gold to titanium to whatever's useful. We'll probably be able to just 3D print en masse anything. We'll probably have AI and robots, if they haven't destroyed us, doing everything for us. So unless they have some sort of religious, spiritual dogma at the heart of whatever their society is that says wipe out anything that isn't you for whatever reason, why would they invade anywhere? So I'm never actually worried about alien invasion, but one thing where I'd still agree where we'd be fucked is the fact that there's no closing that door. It's kind of like, when you're young and you first see a fucked up video on YouTube or the internet back in the day, like you accidentally stumble across a beheading. You can't unsee it. It's just in your brain. I think Bill Burr described it as a little pixel of your soul just drifts away and you can't ever get it back. Like you can't undo it. And it's that same thing where if aliens did just announce themselves, be like, hey, you're advanced enough, welcome to the club, you're in the Federation of Galactic Aliens, here's this species, here's this species from this quadrant, here's how the universe really works. There's a unknown insane step into the beyond that would just be completely fucking terrifying, even if they were coming in peace.
My retort to that is two things. I think you hit the nail on the head earlier when you described Independence Day. Everything in popular culture about aliens is mostly about them invading and trying to kill us, basically. There's loads of example. Even, Alien, it's on the ship, but it's a malevolent creature. Obviously, we do have good examples like E.T., the friendly alien, but most of it's towards aliens being bad. Through the brainwashing element, you automatically start to think it until you do some research. I'm sorry, but that would be the first assumption I think 90% of the people would make. Number one, we'd be terrified, Declan. We'd be shitting ourselves. Even if they came to Earth and wanted to be diplomatic, wanted to be peaceful, and we do see it later on in this film with the arguing leaders and factions, we'd be fucked as Britain. We can't even stay in the EU, let alone the Intergalactic Federation. Do you know what I mean? Like, what chance we got with Keir Starmer talking to aliens?
If they start telling us what to do with our fishing rights and farming things, fuck them, the Federation. It's why this film is such a breath of fresh air, the fact that it's probably one of the, maybe the most believable depiction in film or TV of what it might be like, or what it could be like to make contact with a completely alien intelligence for the first time and try to communicate with them, which is key to this film, which is why early on we have Forrest Whitaker coming in as the colonel to recruit Louise Banks from the university. She must have done some work previously with like the CIA, deciphering something from Taliban for the intelligence service. She's seen the news, she's like, I know what this is about. So he plays some weird, scary sounds, like someone's playing around with GarageBand for the first time.
Where did you come from?
She's like, no, I need to be in the room with him. I can't understand this. And he's like, yeah, I know what you're trying to do. You want to go see him. Everyone wants to see these things. Not happening.
If I think about it, you can't get anything from an audio file, can you? You do actually need to see it in person. We don't know if these creatures communicate with body language like us. We don't know anything. For us human beings, body language plays a huge part, because think of a young child or a toddler that's just grasping the language. They might be saying something that makes no sense, but they might be pointing to something or a direction, and we work out what they want. So
a lot of time body language is even communicating things you don't want to communicate against your will, because it is so instinctual and natural. But I think it's kind of both. Like I guarantee if you stopped and was like, hey, do you want to go see the aliens that have just landed? Like, who the fuck, unless you're like a dick, but she's clearly like, she's an intellectual, not a scientist, but she's like, language expert. Obviously I think she absolutely would want to go see him. But also it's true true that he basically played a 10 seconds that could have been someone's dishwasher. What the fuck is she supposed to give him from that?
I think we've had this conversation though. It's a different film, but it's like if they made a real Jurassic Park, I'd be like, I've seen the films, but I kind of do want to see the dinosaurs.
Mate, even if they said we also have a time machine, and if you go 60% chance get eaten by a velociraptor, I'd still fucking go.
Oh, 60% is a bit high, man.
Yeah, but whatever you say, whatever percentage or thing or point you make, the answer is always dinosaurs.
Yeah,
real dinosaurs.
So she gets whisked off in a helicopter, and this is where she meets scientist Ian Donnelly. He's actually reading one of her books Louise has written, and he reads the passage to her about language, I think, being the great communicator. And it's kind of like a cock-swinging conversation between both of them, to which he replies, it's great, but it's wrong. Science is a cool introduction. What we do know, Declan, is these alien spaceships are landing all over Earth, so that would be even more of a warning sign to me, like, oh shit, they're definitely invading.
Yeah, that's really important, because there's 12 in different parts of the planet. One in China, one in Sudan for some reason.
Yeah, that was strange.
One in the United States, or maybe it might have been maybe like 2 in China, but generally it's spread kind of evenly out. The aliens probably just looked around and was like, all right, there's loads of people over there, let's go land there. Because they're not like landing over cities either, they're kind of random. One's even over the ocean at one point, so maybe they did just choose at random. But it's important because, again, the breakdown in communication and the different languages and how they're constructed naturally lend to slightly different interpretations and sort of semantics on things becomes a big pivotal issue later on in the film, as the different nations, based on their attempt to interpret what the aliens are trying to communicate, leads them to completely different conclusions, and assuming the worst, and possibly at the state of war between each other, between nations, or even war with this new alien civilization that's just shown up.
It got me to thinking, Declan, they don't talk about one landing in Britain specifically.
Yeah.
I wondered where, because it seems to land at like random places. Imagine if it was just like, oh, the alien pods landed in Southend.
Do you know what?
People are like, what the fuck?
That's probably going to be the best representation of us as a country not mattering anymore. When you no longer see Big Ben as one of the buildings getting blown up in end of the world films.
It's just the Brighton Pier gets obliterated. And
Yeah.
you're like, oh, fuck it.
It'll be like somewhere in Poland.
Yeah.
Wherever they go.
Quickly, all the different countries that are normally, friction with each other, they kind of like get their act together, which I hope would happen in real life. And it's like, oh, Russia and China are like sharing their information with each other, and they come to realize that this is such a unique thing that's never happened. It would probably be better if we actually work together. So I like the way that this unbelievable event connects countries. I found that pretty cool.
It's essentially the Cold Era White House to Kremlin red phone, but for all the major nations on Earth that are working to try and work this out and what is going on. But when they arrive in their helicopter, and it's one of those things where it's the difference between writing and filmmaking. In the script, you'd imagine it would have been the helicopter comes across and sees the ship for the first time. It lands nearby. Even a paragraph? It's basically 2 sentences at max. Whereas in the film, it becomes this long drawn out sing with this beautiful score in this long continuous sweeping take as the helicopter flies in around, and we see the ship, this enormous wide shot of the whole landscape, and the ship is just in the middle dominating it, and it fucking gives me chills. That is the bits that is really amazing in films that you kind of forget about. It's hard to remember that moment. You remember the dialogue or maybe, certain moments, but that sequence without any dialogue as they come and see the ship for the first time, and it's building that sense of dread as they go in for their first session, suited up in their red hazmat suits. Kind of reminiscent a little bit of the moon sequence from 2001: A Space Odyssey again. And they're going through and, you're getting that sense of apprehension from Louise Banks and the other people as they're going in. You're literally about to see an alien for the first time. She hasn't seen it. We haven't seen them. We don't know what it's going to be like. Are you going to, be sitting having a cup of tea with them, chatting, like what's going to happen? And again, like 2001, where originally, apparently in the script of 2001, the idea of the Sentinel, the black rectangle, was actually going to be this big glass object that literally would be showing the monkeys images of like, hey, use a tool to hit an animal and stuff like that, which is just so simplistic. It's just so kind of archaic. I don't know how aliens will be able to do it or will be able to do psychic communication or teaching in the future, but it won't be like that. That's just stupid. Doing it is this simplistic design of just a black cube that is somehow this incredible piece of technology is such a better way to go. And it's like this where when they come face to face with the aliens, it's in this weird rectangle corridor that leads to a glass window where the aliens are inside in either some sort of gas or liquid, or don't know what it is at first, but obviously it's the atmosphere that they can exist in, and they're covered by the gases as well. So even throughout the whole film, you never truly get a good look at them. It always creates this sense of mystery, but looking visually at them in their orange hazmat standing out contrastingly with the black corridor and the completely white gassy window, barely seeing the big heptapods or whatever they're called with their tentacles. And I'm not saying it's as iconic as the 2001 Space Odyssey rectangle monolith, but it's in that conversation. Like, it is just banging.
Yeah, I like the fact that they made the area inside so bare. Like, it didn't need anything more than blackness and the white screen. I don't know, I kind of got vibes of, it's kind of like a tablet, and it actually is used essentially like a tablet later on when they're like moving stuff around. And, you know, what did you think of the actual design of the ship? We can see that it doesn't touch the ground, and that's touched on later. It was very minimalistic. Sometimes less is more, you know, and that scene, what you talked about when they're flying over the music and the long shot, it's those kind of scenes when you rewatch the film again where I think to myself, I just wish I could go back in time and watch this for the first time again.
Kind of esque of the first time you see the Brachiosaurus in Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
It's just a visual and the music and the moment of leading up to it that it just makes it all perfect. Cinema fucking magic. So now we've been introduced to this alien beings. We understand that we're not sure how they're communicating. Louise Banks, she has her first couple of sessions trying to figure it out. The first one just about getting over the shock of it. You know, Donnelly throws up in the bin when he comes out. She's all like sweating and like, oh. And they're not really making progress. They're speaking to the other people in Australia and China, and, you know, China are being a little sneaky with what they're revealing. It feels like maybe they're not revealing everything, but mostly everyone's going on good faith between the countries, but no one's really coming up with jack. So the next time they go in, she just says fuck it and rips off her suit because, you know, they're so concealed. Like you said, body language, you know, they can't see. Right now, as much as we're just seeing these misty things through a window, all they're seeing is this little monkey in an orange burqa.
Like a Lego toy.
Yeah, you're just seeing, it's like looking at someone for the first time through a letterbox slip. Yeah. You're like, who the fuck is that? So she takes it off. They're all worried, like, oh, contamination, blah, blah, blah. General's getting angry, but she says fuck it. Eventually, Donnelly's little follower, so he does the same, and puts her hand on the glass, and the entity, the heptapod or whatever it's called, does the same. And this seems to be like a breakthrough moment where, kind of like a squid, it's able to shoot ink out to create a shape, which is essentially kind of like a character, like in Japanese or Asian written languages, that each one is always circular in shape, but always follows a slightly different pattern and indentations, and that is always a fully formed sentence, thought or idea. There's no and then or the in their language. It's all one thing. This is when they actually start making some headway to trying to understand what these things are saying.
That form of language, or I assume it would be like writing for them, the way they shoot it out, it made me realise like how primitive ours is. Like, if you think about it, you know, left to right, one line, whereas they've just conveyed a whole message just with a symbol, and you know, the symbol is never ending. Awe-inspiring when you think about it. It's such clever writing, it really is.
Visually as well, it's just such a cool look, like having it as these ink shapes and physically in the air, which makes you again think like, what is their atmosphere that they're living in that allows whatever this substance is to appear like that, and are they telepathically moving it to form that shape? Yeah, such a cool visual.
And so Ian and Louise make progress through various sessions, and there's a really cool bit in this, because think about it, as you said, he was sick in the bin. This is crazy stuff, you know. like they're going to speak to aliens from other worlds. I mean, I've had a conversation in GCSE Spanish and I went home and threw up in the bin. Do you know what I mean? I like this scene where after Ian's like checking is Louise okay, like she looks a bit washed out, and they start talking about this theory. When you learn a different language, your thoughts become that language and you start to live that language. And he asks Louise, have you had any dreams about this? And she's like, maybe. And then we see a flash where she's dreaming and the alien's in the corner, and it, that whole theory about immersing yourself into something so much that it becomes who you are, like, really struck me.
And like you said, because now that they've started to understand the language and decipher it, and they're building up like their big database of what these different shapes mean, and they're sharing this information with all the other countries, so they're working through it. But at the same time, she's starting to have these flashbacks to her child. And watching it the first time, I always kind of thought, okay, yeah, this is gonna be her motivation because her kid's not around now. So did she die? Did something happen? I don't know. I wasn't really interested in that, to be honest. But we keep going on with the plot, and they're figuring out more and more. And it's interesting where we get to the point now where they actually pretty much have a rudimentary good understanding of a lot of their terms, enough where they can have a conversation of sorts with these beings. But all of a sudden, China and Russia go silent. They refuse to keep sharing information. Something that they uncovered in their last session freaked them the fuck out. They go in for their session, and the being communicates, assumedly what they communicated to the Russians and the Chinese is off a weapon.
Yeah.
So they freak the fuck out because, understandably, like pretty much everyone but Louise Banks and your man freaks out. And probably you'd assume some scientists in the other country, because we even hear at one point that one of the Soviet translation experts was going to whistleblow to the world, and the Soviets executed him. So you realize there's probably scientists all around the world kind of interpreting it differently. But to be fair, the generals and the people in charge of the military, they have to look at it from the worst case scenario. Like, it's their job to think of it that way. So naturally, they don't know. Are they saying, we're going to use a weapon?
We're going to
As in, the aliens are going to use a weapon and kill us with it? Are they communicating this to each of us, saying, hey, we'll give you a weapon, use it on China, or to China, use it on Japan or whoever? Are they trying to divide us? And naturally, again, it's their perception of things. The generals and the military people hear the same thing as the scientists, the same words that are being translated, but they're perceiving it completely differently. So now we realize that we're into this second layer of it, where just figuring out the words isn't good enough. You also have to understand the perception, the POV, how the other person or the aliens perceive reality, or anyone perceives reality, because just understanding the words isn't good enough. You need to understand what filter those words are then traveling through, of how the person's going to treat that information. And this plays out as important for the tensions between the superpowers and the different nations around the world, but also for understanding the aliens, because Louise Banks is starting to not just get these weird visions and dreams, but it seems like her perception of reality and existence is starting to become altered.
Yeah, and Louise Banks rightly points out, hold your horses, hang on. This could be, we don't know this language. This could just be a misunderstanding, a mispronunciation, because even if you do speak the same language, it still happens, let alone a whole new one. And I like the fact that we learn how the different countries are communicating with the beings. China are using specific tiles, kind of like a game, to say, do you mean this? Do you mean that? And, it's like really cool how obviously in these films, America are always the best at everything. So they're making the most progress. But I just found that really cool as well, how different countries would go about approaching it.
She points out as well, if you're using a game to set the parameters to kind of set as the cast that the language can fit into, then it's all done through the lens of you and an opponent. That naturally is gonna bias your trying to understand and translate the language towards an adversarial sort of communication or words. So there's tensions between the nations, but there's also paranoia amongst the public, because naturally they're not getting much info. They're getting various little tidbits leaked out, some true, some that aren't true, but they're pretty much getting nothing. And this paranoia goes across all members of the population, including the wives of some of the soldiers that are sort of manning this thrown together military base nearby the alien ship in America. And one of these wives is constantly in the ear of a certain soldier who ends up taking matters into his own hands and planting a bomb inside inside the spaceship that's set to go off after their latest session. The bomb's ticking down, but Louise Banks and Donnelly decide they need to run back in there because they want to try something out. They just thought of something, so they go back into the session. And just as they're finding out some vital new info, the bomb goes off. Interestingly, though, the alien telepathically fires her and Donnelly through the air to safety just before the bomb goes off. It did it way before the bomb actually went off, so it's almost as if it knew the bomb was going to go off, but it didn't do anything about it, including stopping its other being next to it, because there's two of them in there, from being killed, because the being is killed. So you're kind of wondering, like, why did it do that? That's odd.
Yeah, I did find that weird. If they knew the bomb was there, why didn't they just propel the bomb out before they came in?
So it's starting to lay these seeds. Seeds that don't make sense, but make sense once we understand, and the characters understand, how these things actually perceive reality and why there's that confusion. You're hearing these things that the Chinese are hearing. The reason the Chinese are getting scared or the Russians are getting scared is because, from their last session, these aliens said there is no time. So they're perceiving that as time's running out. Like, we got to act quick. Like, we got to be urgent here. Meanwhile, Louise Banks is getting more and more of these visions of this daughter she used to have, but she decides to go back in to have another session solo. And she ends up actually going into their environment, into their gases. So it's not liquid, but I guess it's gases, and it's a very heavy atmosphere, heavy gases, I guess. Her eyes are going bloodshot and she can barely take it, and she's trying to understand what this thing's saying. It's saying, oh, Elvis died, because they get nicknamed Elvis and Costello. So she's sad about that. He's not bothered about it, but he's not angry at anyone about it. But he reveals finally, in 3,000 years, we need your help. So we're going to help you now. And she's like, but how would you know that? Like, you can tell the future. And if you can tell the future, why don't you just change it or get there beforehand so you don't need our help? But in the scene following it, as the military base is evacuating, because now that one of the aliens has been attacked, everyone's just like, okay, we need to get the fuck out of here. We're going to nuke these aliens. This is fucked up. They're probably going to retaliate with their giant ray guns, like from Mars attacks, and fucking turn us all into rotten skeletons. So everyone's freaking out and running. But she finally has this vision where she's again seeing her daughter, but you realize for the first time, it's not her daughter from years ago. It's a daughter she hasn't even had yet. And as she's learning their language more and more, and like you said, when you learn a language, you don't just speak the language, but it starts to change the way you think, because the arrangement in your thoughts are now different to follow the way the language works. And because of that, she is starting to perceive reality the way the beings do. And this goes into quantum mechanics again, where the idea of superposition and supersymmetry, where particles over here become into contact with a particle over there. And even though it might be at the beginning of the universe and they're here and they know each other and they interact with each other, and then these atoms might end up on the other sides of the universe. But no matter what the space of time, or no matter what the space of distance, they will always have a connection and an influence on each other instantly, faster than the speed of light, faster than anything, instantaneously, not even a speed, essentially, at the same time. That's the way these beings perceive reality, and that's why their language and all their characters are always in a circle. It's because they do not see time as a flowing onwards thing. They perceive time all at once, beginning, middle and end, all in one arrangement that they look through. The same way the generals and the scientists were interpreting the same words completely differently. You had to understand the perception and the way these things perceived the world to understand why the language was getting interpreted different. It's why they said there is no time. They weren't saying hurry the fuck up. They were saying, no, for us there literally is no time. Like, that's not how it works. That's why it saved them but didn't save its mate, because it already seen that part of history and saw that that's what happened. So that's what has to happen, I guess. And it gets into like determinism and all these interesting, great ideas in quantum mechanics and science that I've never really seen explored in a film as interestingly and as well as this. And we realize these visions of the future is her daughter that she's going to have.
From this vision that the being has given her in the future, where, the dust has settled on this and she goes to a function, obviously because of her work on this thing, she's now world renowned, and the Chinese general has come to speak to her. He says, I had to meet you, blah blah blah, you called me on that day to my personal number and you told me my wife's dying words. And she's like, what? And she sees it, he whispers it in her ear, and then she's like,
interestingly also shows her the number.
Yeah.
She's like, how would I have known your number? And he's like, here you go.
So
he's aware of this dysfunction, I guess, as well at this point.
Yeah, he's aware of it. And then she's like, shit, I need to save these beings because they're not malevolent. They're here to help us. So she gets a satellite phone off one of these guys, calls the Chinese general up and says those words. And next thing we see, Declan, the Chinese government has stood down and the rest of the countries start to follow suit. So it's really touching how that vision and her getting close to the being for the first time and the being showing her how it perceives and sees things saves their lives in a respect.
Essentially averted a world war or complete catastrophe by understanding the other person's point of view, which is on paper such a lame fucking thing, but it's so brilliantly done. And it is so true. His wife's dying words were, there's no winners in war, only widows. And that's what changes his mind. But it's also, I'm sure, the fact that it was his wife's dying words and hitting him in that moment. She creates that timeline of events where the crisis is averted. They've received this gift from the beings, so assumedly the beings all leave and they're happy to leave, so assumedly they know that they've done what they need to do to set off the chain of events so that in 3,000 years time, which may as well be right now to their perception, they will be helped by the humans as payback for the gift they've given them. But it's not just been a gift, but it's also been a weird sort of curse of sorts, because Louise Banks is left with knowing her future exactly. She can see it all at once, and she can see that in the future she falls in love with the scientist Ian Donnelly. They have a child, they're happy, they get married, the child gets older and then gets an illness that can't be cured and dies tragically. And it's this weird thing where it's determinism, but it's also not determinism, because she does have free will, because you see her make the choice. Ian Donnelly at this point has no idea that she has perceived this already. And he's just sort of saying what he doesn't know is going to be his first kind of chat-up line to his future wife and mother of his child. But to him, it's just a chat-up line. You see her kind of thinking about it. Like, do I want to do this? Do I want to go through having it? You know, it's essentially they're better to have done and lost than to not have it at all. Because she knows, I'm going to love this child and then I'm going to lose it. And it's going to be the most awful thing that ever happened to me. I'm going to love this man and marry him and have a child with him and be so happy and then lose him. Do I want to do all that? But yeah, of course, because what's the point of not like what, you know, she makes the choice to do it because it is better to have had it and lose it.
Yeah, she decides that the pain that she's going to experience is not large enough to not live it at all, essentially, which is, again, lame on paper, but really well executed.
Throw in a banging musical score and I was fucking nearly tearing up the first time.
Max Richter, The Nature of Daylight. What a beautiful score.
And it's a funny thought, isn't it? Like, what do you think of that, where so much of the fear in life is uncertainty, and especially uncertainty about the future? But imagine the inverse was true, where you knew everything that was going to happen and just had to let it play out. That sounds way worse. That's way more horrifying.
It does. The unknown is a hard thing to deal with, but if you know something terrible is going to happen, that is 100% worse.
Do you remember that film Pig? Spoiler alert for Pig. It's a really good anti-revenge film with Nicolas Cage. Spoiler alert, you've had your warning. The ending of Pig, he finds out the pig's dead, and he says he regrets finding out because she could be alive forever, in my mind, without knowing. And it's that same kind of thing where, you know, you get older and maybe you lose a lot of that, to be honest, a lot of that feeling of my life could be anything, I can do anything. But it's always there. Like, at least in theory, you could always turn it around, you could change anything, you could do anything. It's like, I could go to America. You know, people talk about like, oh yeah, I'm going to move to America and do this and do up a car and travel Europe, and they just never do it. They always talk about it. But at least they might do it in their own mind. There's always the possibility there.
I guess it would be like if someone you love was in a coma for like many, many years. You'd be like, well, they've been in a coma for 15 years. But then at the back of your mind, you'd be like, but they might wake up. They might. Or if someone goes missing and there's no sign of a body, the family must be like, but you never know. There's small
You hear those weird stories where they turned up alive after 20 years.
Exactly.
You know, that's got to be someone. It could be me. You know, just a fucking great film. Do you recommend Arrival?
I put Arrival in the bracket of being a life-affirming film. Seeing it changed my view of the world, much like Interstellar. Like, everything together, it's just a stunning film, and the things that it discusses within it, and for it to be a clever alien film, a cerebral alien film, probably one of the greatest sci-fis ever made, in my opinion.
Sci-fi, I actually think, is a really underused genre for dramas, because you can throw up the wildest ideas events and scenarios that just wouldn't take place in ordinary life, and then think, how would that affect you? And it's a way of amplifying to the extreme certain ways we feel about things. You know, you said in Interstellar, where Murphy realizes, because he went on that particular mission to that particular planet and was there too long, he missed 20 years of his daughter's life growing up from those video messages. I mean, he missed the whole thing anyway, but he didn't even get the video messages to communicate with her. That actually, in theory, is possible in the universe, but it's a way of showing that idea of missing your child's life growing up, not being a part of it, but in an instance. It's something that never happened in everyday life, but it's just such a beautiful way of exploring that idea on an emotional, human level. And it's the same with this film, you know, seeing the same words but getting a completely different message out of it because of their own feelings, their own biases of who they are. Would you still go through with your life, love and lose, even if you know it's going to happen? Would you still do it? And you know, I don't know, would you still do it? Like she does it in the film. That's not necessarily the right answer. I wouldn't judge anyone that wouldn't do it. Science fiction can put us in these insane scenarios. That is so good for dramas, and I wish Hollywood would finance more sci-fis like this, because I have an appetite for it anyway. I hope there's a big enough appetite to make it worthwhile commercially so it happens more often. But yeah, that is an easy recommendation for Arrival.
But I've often wondered, what if all of us in the world discovered that we were threatened by a power from outer space, from another planet? Wouldn't we all of a sudden find that we didn't have any differences between us at all?